Budapest trembled with anticipation in the chilly dawn of March 12, 1946, as four, once powerful leaders of the notorious Arrow Cross Party faced their final moments. These architects of Hungary's darkest chapter stood condemned for unspeakable atrocities committed during their brief but brutal reign. Each execution, carried out by pole hanging, was the nation's attempt to exorcise the demons of its recent past. What lasting effect did these executions have? How did they influence Hungary's identity after the war? Join us as we delve into the executions of the World War II Arrow Cross Party. Arrow Cross Party's path to extremism. In the dark days of World War II, a shadowy force rose in Hungary that would leave a deep and lasting scar on the country's history. The Arrow Cross Party, known for its extreme views and violent methods, went from being relatively unknown to briefly holding power during one of Europe's most chaotic times. It all began in 1935, when Ferenc Szalasi, a former army officer with radical nationalist beliefs, founded the Arrow Cross Party. His ideology was a mix of fascism, Hungarian nationalism, and anti-Semitism. The party's name and symbol, a cross-arrow emblem, was meant to show the unity of Hungary's workers, whether they came from farms or factories. At first, the Arrow Cross struggled to make any real impact in Hungarian politics. Under the rule of Miklós Horthy, the country followed a more conservative path and was cautious of any radical movements. However, as the 1930s moved forward and Nazi Germany's influence grew stronger, more people began to listen to the party's extreme nationalist and racist ideas. The Arrow Cross built its platform on a few key beliefs: extreme Hungarian nationalism known as Hungarism, racism and anti-Semitism, a strong anti-communist stance, support for closer ties with Nazi Germany and Fascist Italy, and promises to reform land ownership and improve workers' rights. Despite these radical ideas, the party won about 30 seats in the Hungarian parliament during the 1939 elections. This small success showed that their message was resonating with some people who were frustrated with the current system and feared the rise of communism. However, the party's path to power wasn't without setbacks. The Horthy government, worried about the Arrow Cross's growing popularity and under pressure from Nazi Germany, sometimes banned the party and even jailed its leaders, including Szalasi. Ironically, these actions often increased the party's appeal, as some saw it as standing up to the establishment. As the war progressed and Hungary's situation worsened, the Arrow Cross continued to wait in the wings. They kept strong ties with Nazi Germany, viewing Hitler's regime as a model for their own ambitions. This connection would become crucial in the later stages of the war. The Arrow Cross's beliefs were deeply tied to Hungarian history and myths. They promoted the idea of Hungarian racial superiority and claimed that the country had a divine right to rule over the Carpathian Basin. This idea, though false, appealed to those who longed for a return to Hungary's past glories and wanted a simple answer to the nation's current struggles. The party spread its message through education and propaganda. They published newspapers, held rallies, and organized youth groups to win over the younger generation. The Arrow Cross also took advantage of the economic and social hardships, offering radical solutions to complicated problems. Although the Arrow Cross gained followers, many Hungarians rejected their extreme views. Opposition came from various corners, including democratic groups, religious leaders, and even conservative nationalists who saw the party as dangerous radicals. The late 1930s and early 1940s set the stage for the Arrow Cross to rise. As Nazi Germany seemed unstoppable and traditional systems in Europe began to collapse, the party's promises of national revival and racial purity attracted more people. They also fed off the growing anti-Semitic feelings in Hungary, which had been fueled by years of propaganda and discriminatory laws. By 1944, as the tide of war turned against the Axis powers and the Soviet Union's forces neared Hungary's borders, the Arrow Cross was ready to seize power. What followed in the coming months would horrify the world and leave deep wounds in Hungarian society. Operation Panzerfaust and the Arrow Cross takeover. In a twist that would change Hungary's future forever, the Arrow Cross Party went from being on the political sidelines to controlling the country, leaving devastation in its path. Their rise to power, backed by the Nazis and driven by opportunism, led Hungary into one of its darkest periods. The Arrow Cross's climb was tied to Hungary's worsening situation during World War II. As the war turned against Nazi Germany and its allies, Hungary found itself trapped between the advancing Soviet Red Army and pressure from its German partners. Miklos Horthy, who had ruled Hungary since 1920, tried to strike a deal for peace with the Allies in October of 1944. This move enraged Adolf Hitler, who had long doubted Horthy's loyalty. In a swift and planned response, the Germans launched Operation Panzerfaust on October 15, 1944. They kidnapped Horthy's son, Miklos Horthy Jr., using him as a bargaining chip to force Horthy to step down. Under pressure, Horthy not only gave up his position, but was forced to appoint Ferenc Szalasi, the Arrow Cross Party leader, as prime minister. This German-backed coup handed control of Hungary to the Arrow Cross Party. Szalasi, who had spent much of the war in prison, suddenly found himself leading the country. He was given the title Leader of the Nation and began setting up a puppet government that followed Nazi Germany's orders. However, Szalasi's government had very little real power. By the time he took over, the Soviet Red Army had already pushed deep into Hungary. The Arrow Cross's control was mainly limited to Budapest and the western parts of Hungary that were still under German control. Despite these limits, the Arrow Cross quickly put their radical ideas into action. They resumed the deportation of Jews, which Horthy had stopped earlier in 1944. Working closely with Adolf Eichmann, the Nazi official behind the final solution, the Arrow Cross helped send thousands of Hungarian Jews to concentration camps. The Arrow Cross didn't only target Jews, they also went after Roma people, political opponents, deserters, and anyone who helped Jews or resisted their rule. Even some of their Nazi allies were shocked by the party's brutal and fanatical behavior. Economically, the Arrow Cross tried to follow through on their promises of land reform and workers' rights. However, with the war and chaos and their limited control, these efforts were mostly symbolic. Their main focus was on using all available resources for the war effort, even though it was clear they were on the losing side. Internationally, Szalasi's government was only recognized by the Axis powers and their closest allies. The Arrow Cross desperately tried to gain more support from Nazi Germany, hoping for military aid to slow down the Soviet advance. They even sent Hungarian soldiers to fight alongside German forces as the war reached Austria and Germany. As Soviet forces closed in on Budapest, the Arrow Cross grew more desperate. In December of 1944, the Soviets surrounded the capital, starting a siege that lasted nearly 2 months. During this time, Arrow Cross members escalated their atrocities, determined to kill as many Jews as possible before the city fell. The Siege of Budapest was one of the bloodiest urban battles of World War II. The Arrow Cross and their German allies made civilians suffer greatly, refusing to surrender even when food and supplies ran out. Many people in Budapest, including those who had initially supported the Arrow Cross, now saw them as a source of suffering. The Arrow Cross regime's short but brutal rule ended with the fall of Budapest on February 13, 1945. In less than 5 months, they caused immense suffering and contributed to the deaths of tens of thousands of Hungarians, especially Jews. Budapest's dark winter. During the harsh winter of 1944 to 1945, Budapest became the scene of unimaginable horrors as the Arrow Cross Party unleashed a campaign of terror that would leave a lasting scar on Hungary. Their short time in power was marked by extreme violence, targeting not only Jews, but anyone who didn't fit their twisted beliefs. The Arrow Cross militias, wearing green shirts and armbands with their Arrow Cross symbol, patrolled the streets of Budapest freely. These groups, made up mostly of young, fanatical members, carried out much of the regime's dirty work. One of the most heartbreaking aspects of their cruelty was their violence towards children. In one horrific incident, Arrow Cross members stormed a Jewish orphanage on Munkachi Street, pulling children as young as 6 to the Danube River. In the freezing cold, these innocent lives were taken by gunfire. Such cruelty against society's most vulnerable showed just how heartless the Arrow Cross regime was. The violence wasn't limited to the streets. Hospitals that had once been safe spaces for Jews became the next target. Jewish hospitals, previously untouched, were now invaded by Arrow Cross forces. Patients were dragged from their beds and killed, regardless of their condition, and any doctors or nurses who tried to intervene were often killed as well. One of the most notorious massacres took place at the Varos Major Street Hospital, where Arrow Cross members, some reportedly drunk, went on a rampage, killing everyone in sight: patients, doctors, and nurses alike. Even hardened Nazi officials who saw the aftermath were shocked by the brutality. The Arrow Cross also attacked protected houses, places that had been established earlier in 1944 under the protection of neutral countries like Sweden and Switzerland. These houses had provided a level of safety for thousands of Jews. Now, Arrow Cross militias raided these buildings, ignoring protests from diplomats and killing the people hiding inside. Perhaps the most chilling and symbolic of the Arrow Cross's violence was the executions that took place along the Danube River. Victims were lined up on the riverbank, forced to remove their shoes, which were highly valuable during the war, before being shot, their bodies falling into the icy waters. This method was not only chosen for its efficiency, but also for the psychological effect it had on the population. The sight of shoes left behind on the riverbank became a haunting reminder of the regime's cruelty. The Arrow Cross executioners didn't limit themselves to guns. There were reports of people being beaten to death, stabbed, or thrown into the freezing river while still alive. Sometimes, groups of victims were tied together and shot so that even if a bullet missed, the weight of the dead would pull the living down into the water. One of the most horrifying incidents happened at the Dohany Street Synagogue, the largest synagogue in Europe. Arrow Cross militiamen stormed into the building, which was being used as a shelter, and began firing into the crowd. The beautiful, historic walls of the synagogue were stained with the blood of innocent people. The Arrow Cross also targeted political opponents, or anyone they saw as a threat. This included members of the Hungarian resistance, both Jewish and non-Jewish, who had been trying to save lives and work against the Nazi occupation. Many brave individuals who risked everything to help others were now hunted down by the Arrow Cross. One such hero was Raoul Wallenberg, a Swedish diplomat who saved thousands of Jews by issuing protective passports and offering safe houses. The Arrow Cross saw him as a significant threat and tried to kill him several times. Although Wallenberg survived the Arrow Cross regime, he mysteriously disappeared into Soviet custody not long after. The exact number of victims of the Arrow Cross terror is hard to determine, because of the chaos of the time and the regime's attempts to hide their crimes. However, historians believe that around 38,000 civilians, mostly Jews, were killed by Arrow Cross militias during their short rule. This number doesn't include the tens of thousands more who were sent to Nazi death camps with the full cooperation of the Arrow Cross. The effects of these atrocities went far beyond the immediate victims. Many Hungarians were traumatized by what they saw or experienced during this time. Families were ripped apart, communities were destroyed, and trust in society and institutions was shattered. It would take generations for Hungary to heal from the horrors inflicted during these dark months. When the Soviet army finally broke through and freed Budapest in February 1945, they uncovered the extent of the Arrow Cross's crimes. Mass graves were found all over the city, and survivors bravely came forward to share their heartbreaking stories. The world was shocked by the sheer scale of violence that had been unleashed during the final months of the war. Flight of leadership. As Budapest's streets echoed with defeat, the leaders of Hungary's brutal regime scrambled to escape justice. The Arrow Cross Party's desperate flight marked the end of their violent rule and began a chaotic chase across Nazi Germany. Ferenc Szalasi, who called himself the leader of the nation, left Budapest on December 11, 1944, just as Soviet forces tightened their hold on the city. His escape stood in stark contrast to the bold speeches he had made just weeks before, urging Hungarians to fight until the end. Szalasi's departure wasn't just an act of cowardice, it was a well-planned operation involving other top Arrow Cross officials and their German advisors. Adding to the symbolic nature of his escape, Szalasi took the Holy Crown of Hungary with him, a relic that had been used for centuries to crown Hungarian kings. By taking it, he hoped to maintain some authority in exile, perhaps even using it to gain favor with the Western allies, whom he foolishly believed might support him against the Soviets. As the leaders fled, they made their way west, stopping first in Szombathely, a city in western Hungary. Here, they briefly tried to run their puppet government, issuing orders no one followed and making plans that had no hope of success. But as the Soviets closed in, Szalasi and his followers crossed into Austria. They set up a temporary headquarters in Vienna, still clinging to the illusion that they might turn things around. However, with Nazi Germany falling apart, they had little hope of staying there long. Their next stop was Munich, the birthplace of Nazism. Even though Szalasi and his group tried to continue acting like a government in exile, issuing proclamations and orders, it was becoming clear that no one was paying attention. The German authorities, overwhelmed with their own problems, had no time for their Hungarian allies. Despite the crumbling situation, Szalasi dreamed of setting up a resistance movement in the Alps. He imagined leading a guerrilla campaign against the Soviets, but these fantasies were quickly shattered as Allied forces advanced. When American troops neared Munich, Szalasi and his remaining loyalists had to flee again, this time to the town of Matzi, near Salzburg in Austria. At Matzi, things were dire. They were running out of resources, and morale was at rock bottom. Some members of the group considered surrendering, while others thought about taking their own lives. But Szalasi, ever the true believer, reportedly spent his last days writing and refining his political ideas, seemingly unaware of the reality closing in on him. The end came swiftly in early May, 1945. When word spread of Hitler's death and Germany's imminent surrender, Szalasi and his men realized their time was up. May 5th, American forces arrived in Matzi, capturing Szalasi and several of his top officials. This moment was more than just a military operation. It carried deep historical weight. The leaders who had caused so much pain in Hungary were now powerless fugitives. The Holy Crown of Hungary, which Szalasi had taken with him during his escape, was recovered by the Americans, symbolizing Hungary's reclaiming of its sovereignty. After their capture, the Arrow Cross leaders were held by American forces, who began investigating the full extent of their crimes. But it soon became clear that they should be tried in Hungary, where the horrors of their rule had been experienced firsthand, and where their victims could testify against them. The process of bringing Szalasi and his men back to Hungary was carefully planned, with tight security in case of rescue attempts or revenge attacks. When they arrived in Budapest, they were faced with the ruins of the city they had fled. The devastation and trauma left behind by their regime were unmistakable, and the Jewish community had been decimated. The capture and return of these leaders marked the beginning of Hungary's long process of facing the horrors of the past. Trials were held, and justice was served, but the scars they left would take generations to heal. The Arrow Cross trials and the path to justice. After World War II, as Europe began to rebuild, Hungary had to face its own recent history. The trials of the key leaders from the Arrow Cross Party became a way for the country to deal with a painful past and look toward a new future. In 1945, the People's Tribunal was set up to bring war criminals and collaborators to justice. This court became the stage for some of Hungary's most important and dramatic trials. Among those on trial were the top leaders of the Arrow Cross regime, including Ferenc Szalasi, Gábor Vajna, József Gera, and Károly Beregfi. Ferenc Szalasi, who had once called himself the leader of the nation, was the main focus of public attention. His trial started on February 5, 1946, in a crowded courtroom in Budapest. The man who had once been so powerful now stood diminished, unable to hide from the evidence stacked against him. The prosecution laid out the horrors of Szalasi's role in the deportation and murder of Hungarian Jews, how he kept the war going unnecessarily, and how he crushed any opposition. Witnesses shared heartbreaking stories of the cruelty and fanaticism of the Arrow Cross regime. In his defense, Szalasi tried to deny the atrocities or explain them away. He claimed he didn't know how bad things really were under his rule, but most people found that hard to believe. He also continued to push his nationalist ideology, Hungarism, even though it sounded empty in a country devastated by war. Gábor Vajna, who had been the Minister of the Interior during the Arrow Cross government, faced similar charges. His trial revealed how the Arrow Cross ran a system of terror. Evidence showed that Vajna had been directly involved in organizing deportations and working closely with Nazi leaders, including Adolf Eichmann. Vajna tried to claim that he was only following orders, but this didn't convince many people. Witnesses described his eager involvement in anti-Semitic policies and his control over the Arrow Cross militias that terrorized Budapest. József Gera, another important figure in the Arrow Cross hierarchy, also struggled to defend his actions. As part of the Regent's Council, he had been involved in top-level decisions. The prosecution portrayed him as someone who was more than willing to grab power, no matter the cost to his country. Károly Beregfy, the former Minister of Defense, was charged with helping prolong the war and working closely with Nazi Germany. His trial exposed how deeply Hungary's military had cooperated with the Nazis in the last months of the war. Beregfy's attempts to justify his actions fell flat in a courtroom full of people who had lived through the war's devastating effects. As the trials went on, they became a media sensation. Newspapers published detailed reports, and the public was deeply invested in the outcome. For many, these trials represented a chance to see justice finally served. The verdicts were not surprising. Szalasi, Vajna, Gera, and Beregfy were all found guilty of war crimes and treason. They were all sentenced to death. The court's decisions were widely supported by a population still recovering from the trauma of the war. The executions were carried out on March 12, 1946, at the Markó Street prison in Budapest. Szalasi, still defiant, reportedly shouted, "Long live Hungary!" just before his execution. With these deaths, Hungary closed one of the darkest chapters in its history. However, the legacy of these trials would continue to impact Hungarian society for decades. They set important legal precedents for how war crimes should be handled and raised tough questions about individual responsibility in times of national crisis. These trials also became a key part of Hungary's collective memory, a reference point when discussing collaboration, resistance, and moral choices under authoritarian rule. For the families of victims, the trials brought some sense of closure, although no legal outcome could ever fully make up for their losses. For others, especially those who had supported the Arrow Cross, the trials felt like justice served by the victors, adding to divisions in Hungarian society. In the larger European context, the Arrow Cross trials were part of a broader effort to deal with the horrors of fascism. Along with the Nuremberg trials and other national proceedings, they were part of an attempt to set new standards for international justice and human rights. The Pole hangings of March 1946. In March of 1946, Budapest experienced a significant and troubling event. The city became the backdrop for the executions of 4 leaders from the Arrow Cross Party, a far-right group that had inflicted tremendous suffering during its short but violent rule. This was more than just ending the lives of these men. It marked a crucial moment in Hungary's struggle to face its painful history and start the healing process. The method chosen for these executions was pole hanging, sometimes known as the Austrian pole method. This technique had been used occasionally in Central Europe since the 19th century and was selected for its dramatic and symbolic impact. The setup was crafted not only for its effectiveness, but also to make a strong statement about betrayal and justice. The process started with a wooden pole, about 10 feet tall, set up in a public square. Unlike traditional hangings, which used a sudden drop to break the neck, pole hanging took a slower approach. The condemned person stood with their back against the pole, their feet tied to its base, and a chest strap secured around their body under their arms. This strap was connected to a pulley at the top of the pole, allowing the executioner to lift the prisoner slightly off the ground. This setup was both dramatic and strategic, positioning the person's neck for the final steps. A noose was placed around the person's neck, but instead of a quick drop, the rope was tightened slowly to create tension. The executioner then had to carefully release the chest strap and attempt to dislocate the person's neck by pushing their head sideways and pressing under their jaw. This required considerable skill and strength. If the dislocation was successful, it led to a quicker death. Otherwise, the person would die from strangulation, a slower and more painful process. For the Arrow Cross leaders, Ferenc Szalasi, the so-called leader of the nation, Gábor Vajna, the former Minister of the Interior, József Gera, a key figure in the party, and Károly Beregfy, the ex-Minister of Defense, the executions were meticulously planned and carried out. The public nature of these hangings was meant to demonstrate justice and signal the beginning of a new era for Hungary. On March 12th, the executions took place at the courtyard of the Budapest Academy of Music. The usual elegance of the venue was starkly contrasted by the grim event. The four men spent their final hours in different ways. Szalasi wrote letters, Vajna prayed, while Gera and Beregfy were mostly silent. As the executions began, the crowd gathered in silence. Szalasi was the first to face the pole. The process of tying him to the pole and preparing the noose was deliberate and stretched over several minutes, adding to the tension. When Szalasi's life ended, the crowd's reaction was mixed. There was no celebration. Instead, there was a somber acknowledgement that justice had been served, though it could not undo the suffering caused. The same procedure was followed for Vajna, Gera, and Beregfy, each meeting their end with varying degrees of composure. The executions were marked by a quiet respect for the dead and a confirmation from doctors to ensure there were no rumors of survival. The bodies were covered with white cloths and left hanging for a while before being taken down. This public display was meant to remind people of the consequences of collaborating with fascism. It sparked debate about justice and the balance between retribution and fairness. While some saw it as a necessary measure to close a dark chapter, others felt it was more about revenge than justice. Executioners needed specialized training to perform the task correctly, and any mistake could lead to prolonged suffering. The memory of these executions continued to shape Hungary's collective consciousness. They were discussed in books, analyzed by historians, and remembered in personal stories. As the crowd slowly dispersed and the city returned to its routine, Hungary was left to deal with the scars of its recent history and the task of rebuilding its identity. Aftermath of the Arrow Cross executions. As the last echoes of the executions faded, Budapest found itself at a turning point. The reactions to the executions of the Arrow Cross leaders were as complex as Hungary's history. People had mixed feelings and questions about what this meant for the nation's future. Right after the executions, Budapest buzzed with emotions. The crowd that had gathered to witness the event slowly dispersed, but many were still trying to process what they had seen. Some felt a sense of closure, believing justice had finally been served. Others felt an emptiness, realizing that no punishment could truly make up for the suffering that had been inflicted. Cafes and street corners became places for conversation. Those who had endured the horrors of the Arrow Cross regime began sharing their stories, many for the first time. These conversations were often raw and emotional, as people talked about the pain they had kept hidden during the chaotic end of the war and the days that followed. For survivors, especially within the Jewish community, emotions were mixed. Some felt relieved that those responsible for their suffering were held accountable, while others found that the executions didn't ease their trauma. The losses they had endured, family, friends, homes, and a way of life, were wounds that no trial or punishment could heal. In the days following the executions, Hungarian newspapers were filled with witness accounts and opinions. Some articles were serious, urging people to see this moment as a turning point in Hungary's history. Others were more sensational, detailing the executions and the final moments of the condemned men. Reactions across Hungary varied. In Budapest and other large cities, where the arrow cross regime had inflicted the most damage, the mood was mostly one of grim satisfaction. In rural areas, where the impact had been less severe, opinions were more divided. Some saw the executions as necessary justice, while others felt disconnected from what they saw as an urban issue. The executions also sparked conversations about collaboration and resistance during the war. Many Hungarians faced tough questions about their own actions or inactions during the arrow cross years. These questions led to painful self-reflection for many people. Politically, the executions were crucial for Hungary's image internationally. The new government, supported by the Soviets, wanted to distance itself from Hungary's fascist past. By making the executions public and widely covered in the media, they hoped to show the world that Hungary was moving away from that dark chapter. However, not everyone saw it that way. Some Hungarians, skeptical of Soviet influence, viewed the trials and executions with suspicion. They questioned whether these events were truly about justice or serving the interests of foreign powers. The rest of the world closely watched Hungary. Global newspapers reported on the executions, often using them as examples of a nation confronting its dark past. This international attention pressured Hungarians to present a united front, even as private opinions remained divided. In the weeks that followed, people set up makeshift shrines at places where the arrow cross had committed atrocities. These spots became places for mourners to gather and served as reminders of the horrors that had occurred. The government also began planning official memorials. Though these efforts were complicated by differing views of history, schools faced the challenge of teaching this recent history. Many teachers who had lived through the events themselves found it difficult to explain such a painful period to their students. The executions often became a starting point for discussions about responsibility, justice, and national identity. Artists and writers began processing the events in their work, creating poems, novels, and plays about the arrow cross period. These works provided a deeper look at the time, exploring the moral gray areas and personal struggles of life under dictatorship. For many Hungarians, the executions marked a psychological turning point. The war had ended months earlier, but seeing former leaders face justice signaled the end of an era. This realization brought relief for some and anxiety about the future as they tried to rebuild their lives in a changed world. The Jewish community, devastated by the Holocaust and arrow cross persecution, faced unique challenges. While the punishment of their tormentors offered some justice, it also raised questions about their place in post-war Hungarian society. As time passed, reactions to the executions evolved from raw emotion to reflective discussion. The executions of the arrow cross party leaders marked the end of a dark chapter in Hungary's history, its past, and the ongoing need to protect democratic values. A reminder as well as a warning of the consequences of extremism and the ongoing quest for justice after World War II. Thanks for watching. See you in our next video.